Greetings, Guardians. My name is Bife here. So, it's been a while since we've done one of these, but we're going to jump in with another tier list. This time we're talking about the dungeon bosses throughout Destiny and throwing them into our tier list from last time, comparing their relative power. Here's the thing though, I think that our previous raid tier list still applies. That tier list is from a few months back, and in there we compared the final raid bosses from all the raids so far, with the exception of Nezarec, which hadn't been released yet. Because all of the bosses for raids and dungeons exist in the same world, I think it's fair that we only judge them against each other on this same scale. So, let's figure out if there are any that can even come close to some of the raid bosses, and let's see how powerful some of these foes that people have been beating with relative ease are in the lore. And let's go over the rules of this tier list again, because it's been a while since we've done one of these. Number 1. We are ranking all of these villains at the height of their power. This helps us to avoid any arguments about timing and circumstances, and it helps us to really understand the true potential of every villain. Number 2. Whilst these are my opinions, I'm not ranking these in a vacuum. My rankings are based on the actual lore of the game, and if there is no reason why a Fallen Dreg should be ranked higher than the Witness, then I won't rank it higher than the Witness. Number 3. I don't know all the lore, surprisingly to some, so if there's some kind of factor that I've missed, then people should let me know for next time, and if there is something glaringly obvious, who knows, maybe I'll talk about it in the next tier list video. Number 4. How easy this thing was for you to fight in-game is not a factor. Different fights can be differing levels of difficulty for different people, and more importantly, your individual raid experiences are way too vast as a collective to account for, so nobody's raid experience is being accounted for. And number 5, whilst other enemies that support these raid bosses aren't being evaluated, there are some instances where their power is considered because of how integral those factors are to them. With all of that being said, the dungeon bosses that we'll be ranking today include only the final bosses and bosses of particular note. As a result, today we're going to be ranking Dul Incaru, the Eternal Return, Zulmak, the Instrument of Torment, the Kel Echo from Prophecy, Captain Avarok the Covetous from Grasp of Avarice, the Nightmare of Galran and the Nightmare of Keitel from Duality, Perseus, Primordial Ruin from the Spire of the Watcher, Ektar, the Shield of Savathun, and Sumuma Ur-Nokru, the Lucent Necromancer, both from Ghosts of the Deep. As a quick reminder for people, the tier list from last time looked a little bit like this. We had bosses such as Oryx and Riven and Rolcup in S tier for their overwhelming paracausal power or supreme wish magic. Down in B tier, we had threats such as Atheon, which was capable of controlling time itself, and yet still did not quite break that paracausal barrier. Raid boss non-disciple Callus found himself down in D tier, and in F tier we had pretty much the run-of-the-mill foes that were just exceptionally strong, such as Skolas the Wolfkel. Bit of a meme, that tier. We will be expanding it in this video. With all of these different bosses in mind, we should be able to tell that the dungeon bosses aren't quite going to be able to hold up to them. They will occupy predominantly the middle and lower parts of the tier list spectrum. Whilst there are a ton of fun and challenging dungeon bosses, I don't think any of them come even close to the power of Oryx, or Rulk, or Riven. With all of that said, let's start with Dul Incaru, the daughter of Savathun. Ranking Dul Incaru is a really interesting affair because we have a little bit of a unique power to contemplate. Her power is really put on display as she's at the heart of the Curse of the Dreaming City. The curse itself is a complex combination of Savathun's wish, Riven's wish magic, and Quaria's manipulation of both time and the Taken. Dul Incaru lies at the center of all of this, and is the powerful wizard whose death heralds the end of the cycle and the beginning of a new one. What scant information we have on Dul Incaru comes partly from the Truth to Power lorebook, which I've said many a times is not to be trusted. What I think we can trust is that the lorebook implies that the daughter of Savathun is capable of manipulating reality, dimensional travel, and even us. Dul Incaru's power in this sense then comes from the fact that no, she isn't able to put up a significant fight against us, but instead she represents a different kind of threat, the threat of attrition via the Curse on the Dreaming City, and subterfuge against all of those that might try to understand her. She is tricksy, much like her mother. It's all pretty hard to talk about this in relative terms, but I think it's worth remembering and simply putting it like this. Dulin will always return and will always be defeated. Her existence is a deliberate blight on the Awoken people, and she fulfills that role really well. If we're to continue to war in the Dreaming City, she will always be an obstacle. As for her power in combat and place in the Hive hierarchy, it's clear that at the height of her power, she was and still maybe is an important instrument of the Witch Queen Savathun. Savathun might not have kept any of her offspring in her immediate orbit, but that isn't to say that her progeny lack for power. Not only does Dulin rank highly in Savathun's armies, but her powers as a wizard shouldn't be underestimated. Overall, Dulin is probably one of the weirdest to rank too because, she's had some scary real-life lore effects. You remember that time when we went back into Shattered Throne and had to complete that supposedly at power level 999, and it all turned out to be a massive hoax? Yeah, all of that partly Savathun's doing, but Dulin played a central role. For that kind of weird fourth wall breaking nonsense, I'm almost tempted to give her a higher ranking, and you know what? I think I will. So yeah, Dulin is one of the weirdest of these bosses to rank. There are a lot of factors that leave her in limbo, and a lot of dependencies that grant her her high station, and yet, she's a part of what ails an entire people. She can be killed, but she'll always return, every 3-week cycle. With the manipulation of time thanks to the Curse on the Dreaming City and a very powerful army at her command, I think at very least she needs to be either high B tier or low A tier. When comparing her to the powers such as Oryx and Atheon, I do think that some of the power is contingent on other beings, which does drop her ranking somewhat. But the fact that she's continuously resurrecting means that I think she's actually on par within that A tier. I think that if you are going to rank all these three, then it's a very tricky conversation to have, because you need to question, is she above Atheon? Is she below Crota? I think that she is just above Atheon because of her paracausal abilities, but at the same time, I think she's just below a being such as the Sanctified Mind, due to its greater links to the darkness at the heart of the Black Garden. A solid rank for sure. I don't know if she quite reaches the rank of Crota the Son of Oryx, but honestly, it's still a very respectable rank, and sadly for the rest of the bosses, it only goes downhill from here. Next up we have Zulmak, the Instrument of Torment, and I'm not gonna lie, this one will surprise some of you because it's much lower than many of the other Hive bosses on this list. To understand what's happening here, you need to know what happened to Crota's brood after his death. All of the Hive in the Hellmouth were thrown into disarray, and eventually the practice of ritualistic slaughter amongst their ranks began as a means of kind of throwing everything back to their main cultural identity. This was done specifically so that they could have a strong champion emerge from that chaos. Zulmak was almost that champion, but was defeated in the last moments by an abominable combination of two members of the so-called Inquisition of the Damned. Long story short, a Hive Knight's soul was forced into the body of a Hive Wizard. That wizard took up 2 Hive Cleavers and promptly beat the snot out of Zulmak and half the leadership of the Hellmouth brood. Zulmak was resurrected by Savathun and placed into service of the 4 remaining leaders of the Lunar Hive, Crota's 4 daughters. However, this wasn't some kind of alliance, this was literally done so that Savathun could grow our potential power, given that she had her own reasons for us to be powerful in the future. This is also the reason, by the way, why the Deathbringer exotic rocket launcher was forged. All of it is Savathun's manipulation, all of it was fed to us to make us more powerful. Zulmak is literally a whetstone upon which we sharpen ourselves. He lacks the greater power of a true Ascendant Hive, and is at the heart of the weakened Hive brood as not much more than a powerful enforcer. So I guess the real question is, where does this land him? Well, it's definitely not anywhere close to the warrior that he emulates in the form of Crota. I would say that if we were to rank him, we should be looking somewhere lower on the list. Now, to be fair, he did fight his way to the top of a Hive brood. Granted, it was weakened, but that's nothing to sneer at. But we should also remember that in the grand scheme of things, he is nothing compared to a bunch of the stuff that's on the tier list. My real question then ends up being, is he more tenacious than Taniks, our lowest entry in E tier? And honestly, I don't know if he is. In all seriousness, if it was a knockdown, drag-out fight, I would favor the odds of a fallen legendary mercenary with a knack for coming back from the grave. So yeah, much as it may seem weird to some, his lack of true paracausal power puts him close to the bottom of E tier, and that I think is where Zulmak is going, landing firmly close to the bottom, a minor footnote in our story, and honestly a forgettable champion of the Hive that I think if all forces of any other boss were brought to bear, would be beaten by many of them. Next up, we have one of the weirdest forces to rank, which is the Kel Echo. This is going to be the case for a lot of dungeon bosses, but we'll start off with this Kel Echo, which is something formed by the Nine. I think there's no easy way to rank this one either, and I think that no single assertion about the power of the Kel Echo can possibly be proved to be correct. I say that partly because this one very much comes into the question of how powerful are the Nine, and, well, there's no good way of knowing that, to be completely honest. What I can say is that as sentient dark matter, they're not nothing, ironic as that statement may be. Within the Drifter's Hall that hangs behind the derelict, there is the seeming power of the Nine to manipulate reality, and within that reality, they try to show us, in the course of the Prophecy Dungeon, some fundamental truths about light and darkness, as well as a few predictions about the future enemies and, well, problems that we'll face in Sol. Their ability to do this, and create what the Drifter calls counterfeit Taken, is something that we shouldn't underestimate. It's never been clearly defined whether these Taken are comparable or as capable as the Taken under the command of Oryx, the Taken King, or even the Taken under the command of the Disciples, or even the Taken directly controlled by the Witness. I would say that this still makes their power notable, but I have to assume that the power of the Taken entities here is not the same as the power of the Taken entities that are combined and controlled by the Witness. But who knows, we still don't know what's going on with these particular Taken. And thus, we need to take the Kel Echo pretty seriously, but there's lots of question marks about how powerful this thing really is. The point of the Prophecy Dungeon was to demonstrate to us that the light and dark are tools that we need to use, and we need to use both of them. But it was also a look into the future. In my opinion, and this is never confirmed but it is very heavily implied, the Kel Echo that we fight is supposed to be a comparison to Eramis, the Kel of the House of Salvation, a darkness-infused fallen with fearsome combat abilities, and it's represented probably one of the strongest forces that the Nine throw at us in this dungeon. So I guess the question partly becomes, how strong is this mirror of Eramis? There are so many places you could rank this on the tier list, and I'll be completely honest when I say I have no clue where the right ranking for it is. But for the moment, I think that ranking it somewhere in D tier is probably the safest. I don't think that this is as powerful as a true witness-bound Taken, which means that it might not have the same degree of paracausal punch that the normal Taken do. We also don't know if these Taken can actually be deployed as forces, because the only times that we've seen them are in Gambit, and in the various activities that we do inside the Hall, inside the Drifter's realm. So it's really hard to say whether these things can actually even be deployed as a combat power. It's hard to say if they even exist. So yeah, I don't know. It represents perhaps an echo of Eramis as expressed by the Nine. I think the reality warping nature of the Kel Echo makes it more powerful than pre-Disciple raid Callus and Argos, the planetary core, but only barely. It just squeaks in at the top of D tier. And again, this is where the tier list may start to fall apart. I can absolutely see you lot disagreeing with this, because if it is passing that test of is it paracausal or not, this thing should be somewhere up in A or B tier. But then again, we just don't know. The whole other realities thing and how bosses work within that weird space of the Hall is so undefined that it's really hard to know. So let me know down in the comments section, because there's every chance that I'm wrong about this. There's every chance as well that I've missed some lore about this too. So if I have, let me know. Next up, we have Avarok the Covetous, the captain final boss at the very end of the Grasp of Avarice dungeon. I'm not gonna lie, if you were looking for a fun villain, this is definitely a 10 out of 10 in terms of theme. But in terms of real power, Avarok isn't really doing that much. He is effectively a fallen captain, according to his rank. But given his size, I'd say that that's merely a formality. I would assume that he is at very least at the strength of a Baron or an Archon. But the problem for Avarok is that even with this, he doesn't rank very highly on our tier list. If Skolas, the head of a powerful fallen house, is someone that I was happy to rank in F tier, then we've got to assume that a fallen freelancer who we've never heard of would rank lower. Taniks the Scarred he is not. An infamous fallen mercenary who continuously comes back from the grave, he is not. We have no proof that this is a powerful enough combatant to compete with a Kell, even with the hoard of powerful loot that he currently sits on with his crew, and so, yeah, I don't think that he's in that position where he gets to go above our wonderful friend Skolas from the House of Wolves. I also don't think that he and his crew have the coordination and power of a Cabal Val, especially not one with a fleet at his back. I believe that in Captain Avarok we have a new contender for canonically one of the weakest bosses in the setting, and as a result he's going to sit firmly at the bottom of F tier. Honestly, if there was some lore that distinguished what he was doing differently, maybe we'd be able to give a little bit more distinction, but for the moment, he just seems like a very powerful fallen pirate mercenary who just so happened to sit on a massive pile of loot. And that does not speak to power, it speaks to luck. Next up, we have another pair of difficult dungeon bosses to judge because these next two bosses are nightmares from the Duality dungeon. I guess what I should say is that before any of this really gets spoken about, similar context to the Kell Echo probably applies to these two, but luckily with nightmares, we do at very least get a little bit more of a context to what they are. So yeah, we should talk about what they are before because it's going to make things a whole lot more complicated. First of all, there's the fact that all of these things are inside Calus's mind. That makes them immediately less of a threat because they're limited to Calus's dreamscape. Inside Calus's mind, they can wreak havoc and represent a significant threat, but they're not real, at least not until we connect to that realm. However, they are technically nightmares, and nightmares are special in themselves because they represent a defensive mechanism from Nezarek's pyramid on the moon. This isn't nothing either, because there's some statements from the Bungie team in the marketing of Shadowkeep that states that we technically can't kill nightmares, we can only banish them. The only instance in which we've actually been able to defeat nightmares truly is by turning them into memories, and of course, we did this in the Season of the Haunted with the assistance of Eris Morn and her Nightmare Harvester. So what does this mean for our two dungeon bosses? Rereading the script for this and actually taking a second thought about it, I actually do want to go ahead and pose a little question to you, which is this. I think that these nightmares have a little bit of an ace in the hole for them, and that is this. Whilst they are based on the fears and previous experiences of other people, and whilst they're based on Calus's, they're inside his own head. But if we ever took on those fears, those nightmares might manifest like the others on the moon. If that ever happened, I think these nightmares would suddenly become much higher ranked on the tier list. I think that we'd be looking at the upper half of the tier list, certainly nothing close to A tier or S tier, but certainly something at high C or low B. These are darkness-infused enemies, and whilst it seems that conventional forces can potentially defeat them at great cost, it's only Guardians that have the true paracausal power to push them back. However, I am going to treat this, with all fairness in mind, just as I would have treated the Kell Echo. So, I'm going to rank these two enemies further down in the tier list. That means that we're going to go ahead and put them close to the top of D tier. Now I think it's clear that Keitel is stronger than Galran, so she's going to go ahead of him. And with that said, I think that this is potentially closer to a ranking that seems fair. Though I will sit there and say that lots of you may disagree with how I've ranked this. It's entirely possible you think it's unfair that poor Captain Avarok, who actually does exist, is ranked lower than someone's nightmare. If that's the case, then feel free to let me know in the comments section, but again, this was always going to be a confusing part of the tier list, especially when we delve into other realities. So, there we have it. At the very top of D tier, we have Keitel, followed swiftly by Galran, and then the Kell Echo, and all the others following behind them. Next up, we have the boss of the Spire of the Watcher, Perseus, Primordial Ruin. As a member of the Sol Divisive, It's an Axis mind that is part of a particular grouping of Vex that is far more powerful than the others, in my opinion. The Sol Divisive work to carry out the whim of the Witness and therefore are more powerful than your typical Vex because of their link to the literal power of darkness. Perseus is no exception to this, but I think it'd be wrong to state that their power is something close to that of the Sol Progeny, or the Sanctified Mind, or the Consecrated Mind. This is a lesser member of a powerful Vex subtype, and therefore is definitely going to beat out those other forces that might lack some link to paracausality. The real sticking point is how much of the Witness's power can be found in this one Vex frame, and I'm going to go out on a limb and say, with all the stuff that we discovered in Lightfall, not that much. The Vex of the Sol Divisive were actively interrupted by Taken forces in the Black Garden because they weren't directly obeying the Witness's will immediately and with such swiftness and speed. So whilst it's linked, I don't know if it really pulls that much power, and that's really going to send this thing down in the tier list. It is something that is a tool and a powerful force at that, but it's kind of blunt and meandering and imperfect for the task at hand. There's also no instance in which this thing has defeated Guardians, unlike Siva, which, of course, has defeated the Iron Lords and made up Axis the Archon Prime. So this one is very much up for debate, but I feel comfortable ranking this just lower on the tier list. I'd say that Argos is just a little bit more powerful, and that's saying something still, because as a Vex of the Sol Divisive, this is still a powerful frame, but it's worth remembering Argos is literally a planet core. If Perseus is empowered by the darkness and the Witness in any way, even slightly, there's a good chance that upon interfacing with other Vex, the result would have been a stalemate, or something that the Vex would deliberately avoid, but I've got to assume that the power of something at the center of the planet would be able to defeat something of the Sol Divisive. There is a big question mark there, but for the moment, I am happy ranking Perseus below Argos the Planetary Core on this tier list. With the little caveat that if ever the Witness directly empowered this thing, then you would probably see it hike really far up the power scale. But then again, the same could be said for any of these bosses, so take that with a grain of salt. Next up, and the last two of our bosses, we get the bosses from the Ghosts of the Deep Dungeon. And we start with a pretty interesting boss in the form of Ekthar, the Shield of Savathûn. This is the first of our two Hive Guardians on this tier list. The powers of a well-practiced Guardian are something to behold, regardless of whether they're a Hive Guardian or a more normal human Awoken or Exo one. This immediately puts them a cut above most of the forces on this tier list, with enhanced resilience against death thanks to their ghosts, and abilities comparable to our own. This means that we're easily putting these above most of the things on the list, somewhere probably in A, B, or S tier. I'm going to go ahead and let you know right now, I'm not putting them in S tier. That's simply just reserved for truly world-ending bosses with incredible power. But I do think that there's something else to be accounted for which will help us narrow down where these bosses should be. And that is simply this: they may be Guardians, but I don't think they're as skilled as we are. Sure, they have our powers and they can perhaps overpower a new Guardian, but if you asked me to place a bet on a Guardian of the Tower or a Hive Guardian, I'd bet on us every time. We've been around for years, have been able to figure out the ways to use our light better, and frankly, we have a greater repository of knowledge and training and techniques. We have the Crucible, and the Hive Guardians have only been established for a little over a year. With that said, Ekthar is also a storied Hive warrior, even if he can't remember his old life, which is entirely possible. He was once the Sword of Oryx, and seemingly reported to the Taken King himself. That makes him easily comparable to members of the Court of Oryx, but not necessarily within the core forces at the heart of Oryx's dreadnought, such as Golgoroth and the War Priest. What I would say, though, is that it gives a certain degree of understanding as to how powerful this being is. They most certainly are an Ascendant Hive, and the paracausality that they wield, if any, is lesser than most, but is still worth considering. This is also something which needs to be thought of when you think about the mission and how risky it is. When I say the mission, I mean the actual moment where the Hive crashed their ship into the oceans of Titan. Because you know what? They were going up against both us and technically were attracting the forces of Xivu Arath. So yeah, they needed to have some serious firepower on their hands for them to feel confident. and for Ekthar to be that, I think it makes a lot of sense. Given the fact that they are not a Hive Guardian, I am going to rank them in mid-B tier, just above Atheon times Conflux. I know that that's something that you might disagree with, because again, it really does depend, but I do still believe that that paracausality barrier that Atheon can sometimes represent is something which could have been overcome by Ekthar and other Hive Guardians. After all, Guardians make their own fate is the line at the very center of the Vault of Glass and our success within it. And Ekthar is, much as we might not like it, a Guardian. They were chosen by a ghost, and as a result, I think he's someone that we should not underestimate. I would definitely bet on him over Atheon, assuming that the same conditions in the Vault of Glass were applied to him as were to us. Finally, we have Simuma Urnokru. Someone at some point told me that this is pronounced Shimuma, but I don't know, I can't verify that, so Simuma it is. It should come as no surprise to any that if you have the power of necromancy, it's going to make a difference. It's not the craziest of differences, but it's not nothing either. Most of the points that we said about Ekthar apply here too. I think it's worth analysing just a little bit of in our own time, because necromancy was a power that was able to tempt Nokris, one of the sons of Oryx, into a position of exile, and allowed him to create his own offshoot of Hive, and they were somewhat powerful in their own right. Combining that power with the power of a Lightbearer has created perhaps one of the most interesting supporting commanders that one could have asked for. That being said, some caveats that applied to Ekthar apply to Simuma as well. Hive Lightbearers tend to play second fiddle to us originals, and I really do feel like they are less powerful than us. Now granted, again, Simuma is someone we've met in the past. We saw her in the Strange Terrain Strike. This was a moment where she appeared and most likely immediately got destroyed by Wardcliff Coilfire. Yeah, if you didn't see her, and if you don't remember her, you can hardly be blamed. With that in mind, I'm actually going to go ahead and still place Simuma above Ekthar in terms of power, and that's actually because of the fact that, well, if you're looking at what she was doing, she was conducting a ritual to attempt to resurrect Oryx, the Taken King. It's a really powerful thing in and of itself, but I think the caveat needs to be applied that, as Sloane stated at the very end of the dungeon when you complete it, it's not even clear if that would have worked. Regardless, they were powerful enough that they believed they could try, and that in itself is something we should take very seriously. The power to resurrect a god is nothing small, so I think high B tier is actually worth it. All that being said, I think the real question then becomes, how do you juggle her power versus that of Dulin Karu? And honestly, I do still think it's lower, but purely because of the fact that resurrecting Oryx versus tormenting an entire civilization for the entirety of their remaining existence is not... I mean, how can you really judge that power? If we killed Oryx and we are Guardians, then how is a Hive Guardian resurrecting him worse than an entire civilization being locked away? Asymmetric factors, something that maybe you can judge for yourself in the comments section again. So yeah, there's my ranking on this tier list. I imagine there's going to be quite a bit of disagreement on it in the comments section, so let me know where you stand. Remember, we're ranking these according to their power in the lore. Maybe you think I've got a few things wrong here. Is there something I've missed about Avarok that makes him secretly an incredibly powerful fallen commander? Is there something that I've missed about the Kel Echo and the various nightmares that means they should be higher up on the tier list? Should I rank them as though we're facing them in reality? Is there something that I've missed about one of the various Hive Guardians or Hive combatants on this list? If so, let me know down below. If you enjoyed the video though, go ahead and leave a like, and if you want to see the actual first video in this series, where I ranked the raid bosses thus far, go ahead and check that out down below too. Next time if we do another tier list, I'll be going over D1 or D2 strike bosses, and I'll also be clear to update things and add Nezarec into the list, so look out for that in the future. But as per usual, know that your viewership as always is quite enough for me, and that in the meantime, my name is Byf. Horodacia Arastra. I'll see you Starside.